March 5th, 2017, the town of Narovlaya, Belarus. Just yesterday evening, drunken shouts and laughter could be heard from one of the houses on Oktyabrskaya Street. The criminal recidivist Alexei Mikhalenya, a local criminal celebrity, was celebrating his release from prison. The street is quiet and empty this morning. To Maxim Fateyev, who decided to visit his relatives Viktor and Raisa Fateyev, it even seems too empty and quiet. As if something bad has happened and now everything around is holding its breath, waiting. Maxim stops his bicycle by the gate and enters the yard calling for his aunt and uncle, but no one answers him. In the bright spring sunlight, bloody footprints are clearly visible on the snow and the porch leading around the house. The footprints lead Maxim Fateyev to the basement, where the motionless body of his aunt lies on her stomach. When Maxim turns her over, he can't help but scream. Instead of a face, the dead woman has a bloody mess of flesh and bone. While Maxim tries to recover from the shock and calls the police, in the house across the street, Alexei Mikhalenya hurriedly throws things into a suitcase. He needs to run, to hide, before they come for him. If they catch him, he'll end up back in prison. They give the death penalty for such crimes, and he's very afraid of the death penalty. A sudden loud knock on the door startles Mikhalenya into stillness. Alexei Mikhalenya was born in the Yelsk district of the Gomel region in 1984. He had a medical diagnosis of mild intellectual disability and studied at a boarding school. Since childhood, Lesha was known for his difficult character. He was rude to elders, quick-tempered, and easily got into fights with his peers. Besides everything else, the boy was prone to stealing and would take anything that came to hand. School supplies, classmates' belongings, and he even rummaged through teachers' bags. Petty thefts were a common thing for him, and when he got caught, Lesha didn't feel any remorse. Only his parents worried and blushed. Alexei Mikhalenets frequently ran away from the boarding school out of boredom. He found neither studying nor sitting at a desk interesting. Alexei was much more attracted to the adult world, where you could do whatever you wanted. In the adult world, Mikhalenets quickly developed a habit for alcohol. The 17-year-old guy didn't want to study or work anywhere, so he often begged, actually extorted money for alcohol from his elderly neighbors. Outspoken and physically strong, Mikhalenets often got into arguments with his neighbors, threatened them, and they feared that the hot-tempered guy might attack them with his fists. The elderly people preferred to give him money. Alexei felt this was the way it ought to be. Mikhalena had a couple of friends in Narovlya, teenagers just as aimlessly wasting their lives, who had gotten into drinking at an early age. Gathering in groups, they often spent evenings at someone's house or out on the street drinking alcohol, swearing and scaring passers-by. In October 2002, when in the middle of yet another drinking session it turned out that the vodka was gone and there was no money left, Mikhalenya and his friends decided to break into the house of an acquaintance, a pensioner. Breaking the window, they got inside and after taking the money, quickly ran away. The elderly man didn't want to deal with the drunken teenagers at night, but the next day he decided to have a serious talk with them. But Mikhalenya was still drunk. As soon as the man threatened to tell the boy's father everything, an argument broke out. Grabbing a rolling pin, Mikhalenya hit his neighbor with it. When the elderly man doubled over in pain and groaned, Alexei decided that the lesson had been learned. Tossing the rolling pin, he departed. The pensioner abstained from contacting the police, possibly out of fear or other undisclosed reasons. Be that as it may, convinced of their own impunity, Mikhalenya and one of his older friends decided to rob other elderly neighbors at night. After removing the window panes, they entered the house and rummaged through the cabinets. The noise woke up the elderly owners, husband and wife. The man tried to reason with the teenagers, but they were drunk and wouldn't listen. A fight broke out. Mikhalenya hit the pensioner on the head with a shovel, and when he fell, started beating him with fists and feet. They finished off the unfortunate man with a shiv made from a welding electrode. The lady of the house met the same fate. After making sure that the unnecessary witnesses to the crime were dead, Mikhalenya and his companions started searching the house for money, but they didn't find anything. Taking some groceries and half a bottle of wine, the failed robbers went home empty-handed. They returned to the scene of the crime the very next day to cover their tracks. They climbed in through the window at night, carefully removing the glass. The criminals wiped the floor and walls with a wet cloth to wash away the blood splatters, cleaning up so that there would be no visible signs of struggle or bodies. So, the bodies lying on the floor, Michalenia and his companion carefully wrapped in a blanket loaded them onto a metal cart and took them to the Pripyat River. Choosing a quiet and deserted spot, the criminals tied ceramic drainage pipes to the legs of the bodies so they wouldn't float to the surface. After that, they took both bodies out to the middle of the river in a boat and threw them into the water. After returning home, the friends agreed to lay low for a while and see what would happen. None of them were tormented by pangs of conscience. As it turned out, committing a crime and not getting caught was actually quite easy. After some time had passed and the initial fear of being exposed had subsided, Michaleni and his friend visited the home of a lonely woman in their native Narovlia. There was no money there either, so the robbers had to take whatever they could find, a mirror and some stereo headphones. After that, Michaleni's gang moved to the Mazur district, where they robbed and beat a man they randomly encountered in the forest. To finish off the victim, Michalenia stabbed the 67-year-old man in the neck with a knife. The dying man was thrown into a ravine and covered with branches. Later the man was found, but they couldn't save him. He died in the hospital a few days later. In the same Mazur district, Michalenia committed another attack, this time on a store. The saleswoman couldn't handle the two tall and strong guys. Michalenia and his accomplice took the money from the cash register, but it turned out to be little. The enraged guy started beating the woman, and passing hunters saw this. The men started shooting into the air, hoping to scare the criminals. Michalenia and his accomplice took off running. But this time, luck turned away from the criminals. The hunters' dogs, which they immediately set on the trail, found them. And the relative of the injured woman also gave chase on a motorcycle. He caught up with the fleeing men and fired into the air, ordering them to stop. Frightened, Michaleni and his friends surrendered and allowed themselves to be taken to the police. While Michaleni's gang of robbers was wreaking havoc in the neighboring district, the relatives of the pensioners who died in Rovlinsk became alarmed. The man and woman stopped answering phone calls and no one was opening the door. It seemed that the elderly people had simply disappeared without a trace, as if they had vanished into thin air. A search was announced. Investigators and forensic experts visited the house, and at the crime scene they discovered traces of blood. Michalenia and his friends didn't notice anything during the cleaning. There was blood on the wallpaper, on the furniture, and also on a shovel and an axe handle that were leaning against the wall. The forensic medical examination determined that the blood belonged to a woman and a man. Without a DNA analysis, it was impossible to determine the exact origin of the blood, but the investigators logically assumed that it was the blood of the homeowners and that a crime had been committed. They would likely have to search for bodies, not living people. But who attacked the elderly people and why? The investigators began questioning the acquaintances of the missing couple. Soon, a circle of people was identified with whom the pensioners had bad or tense relationships. Michalenia, who often extorted money for a bottle of vodka from the couple, was also among the suspects. He had already been detained for robbery, so there was no need to look for him. The criminal denied it for a short time and soon told what had happened. A search party for the bodies was immediately organized. Divers searched the bottom of the Pripyat River from the place where the bodies were thrown into the water and further downstream. They were only able to find a red blanket, which, according to Michaleni, one of the bodies had been wrapped in. They also searched for the bodies on land. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood found in the house belonged to the missing pensioners. The blood on the axe handle and the shovel was also theirs. Several dozen witnesses were interviewed, and other additional examinations were conducted. During the investigation, 9 more serious crimes committed in neighboring Snorovlia and surrounding areas were solved. Several people ended up on the defendant's bench at once, including Alexei Michaleni. His 19-year-old accomplice received 25 years of imprisonment, while Michalenia himself and another member of the group, who was also a minor, was sentenced to 12 years in prison each. This was the maximum term that could be given to minors. Alexei Michalenia went to prison for the first time while he and his accomplices were already serving their sentences. When the remains of 2 people were discovered on the bank of the Pripyat River, an examination confirmed that these were the bodies of the missing pensioners. And that means Michalenia and his accomplices were not lying. Alexei Mikhailenia was released from prison in 2014, having fallen under an amnesty. Life in prison was not easy for Mikhailenia. His unruly temper made itself known. There were often clashes with his cellmates. He waited for his freedom impatiently, but as it turned out, it wasn't to start a new life from scratch. Alexei Mikhailenia left prison already a man in his 30s. By that time his mother had died and his father had become almost disabled due to illness. Arkady Mikhailenia hoped that his son would help him around the house, maybe think about getting a job and start a family. But Alexei was still not interested in any of that. He quickly fell back into his old habits and returned to alcohol and drunken fights. He started dating a girl, but he wasn't thinking about getting married, he was just having a good time. Before long, Mikhailenia found himself back in prison for theft, serving a brief sentence of only 18 months. On February 28, 2016, Alexei Mikhailenia, already a seasoned repeat offender, returned home once again. As usual, he celebrated his return with friends and his girlfriend, who had waited for his prison release. The cheerful celebration lasted until March 4th. On that day, Arkady, Alexei's father, decided that he needed a haircut. In the house, neither a razor nor scissors had ever been kept, so Arkady sent his drunken son to the neighbor, telling him to come back quickly. Alexei and Mikhailenia returned home with blood on their hands. The neighbor didn't have any scissors. She had either given them to someone or just didn't want to look for them when she saw that Alexei was drunk. Mikhailenia could have gone back home, but the idea had already taken firm root in his drunken mind. I need a haircut, I need scissors, I'll get them no matter what. The Fateyev siblings, Viktor, 61, and Raisa, 59, both retirees, recently moved to Narovlia. They lived in the house next door and were busy renovating it. Viktor and Raisa were known as peaceful, non-confrontational people who didn't drink and were well respected in their village. Arkady Mikhailov was well known and people often visited him, offering their help. That night, his drunken son Mikhailov decided to go to them for help, made his way to the Fatiyevs and started banging on their door. Viktor, who opened the door for him, immediately realized who he was dealing with. The neighbor's son, who had just gotten out of prison, was clearly drunk. He had probably also heard about Alexei's violent temper. The man started a conversation with Mikhailenia, asking about his life, hoping the guy would calm down and leave. He even offered him a smoke. Later, they shared the butt of a cigarette together. The criminal and his future victim will become one of the key pieces of evidence in this case. It is not known for certain what words or actions of the elderly man made the drunken Alexei become enraged. He attacked the man first with his fists, then grabbed a stick. At the sound of the noise and screams, Viktor's sister Raisa ran out. Alexei hit her with the stick, making her fall to the ground, then switched his attention back to Viktor. Somehow, after pushing Mikhailenia away from himself, Viktor rushed to the gate to call for help and summon the police. Alexei understood that if the pensioner managed to run, he would end up in prison again. Suddenly, headlights from a car flashed on the road past the house. Viktor shouted hoarsely and waved his arms. Alexei, realizing that he could not hesitate any longer, ran after the pensioner. Catching up with Viktor at the gate, he intercepted him and punched him twice in the solar plexus. Viktor gasped, doubled over, and fell. Mikhailenia had barely caught his breath when he heard a groan coming from the direction of the house. Raisa, who had gotten back on her feet, also tried to escape, heading toward the gardens. Gripping the stick more comfortably, Mikhailenia rushed after her. A blow, another blow to the head. He could feel only the crunch of bones under the stick. There were no emotions at that moment. For some time, the criminal darted between the man and the woman, who were desperately trying to save themselves. And then, finally going completely wild, he rushed over to Viktor, who had lost consciousness, and started beating him with a stick until he stopped moaning. When the man finally breathed his last, Mikhailenia was breathing heavily. And yet he still heard Raisa, bloodied and with a broken head, trying to get up again. The woman barely managed to get to her feet when the criminal grabbed her by the shoulders and pushed her against the wall. Raisa crashed into the windowsill, groaned, and slid down the wall from the windowsill to the floor. Long nails scattered beside her. The mind of the drunken Alexei fixated on those nails. Turning the half-conscious and already wheezing Raisa onto her back, Mikhailenia grabbed a long nail. 1, 2, and in each of the woman's eye sockets there was a nail. Mikhailenia carefully pushed them in as far as they would go, right up to the head, feeling the point pass through the bone. By the time he finished, the woman was dead. The examination later determined Victoriu Michalenia received over 20 blows and Raisa 30. Almost all of them were to the victim's head areas. Alexei understood the bodies had to be disposed of quickly, as his father was likely already worrying. He quickly threw Raisa's body into the basement. The criminal dragged Victor's body into the garden and left it there. There was no time to get rid of the weapon or cover up the traces. At home, Prayak was waiting. With bloodied hands, Michalenia made his way home. When he entered, the first thing he did was thoroughly wash his hands and wipe them with a towel. All night, Michalenia tossed and turned in bed, and in the morning he decided to flee to Russia, supposedly to find work since he had no luck with a job here. But he didn't make it in time. Already the next day, March 5th, Fativ's nephew Maxim found Raisa's body in the basement by following the bloodstains. They called the police, the investigators arrived, and the service dog found Victor's body as well, with his face mutilated and smashed by a stick. Alexei Michalenia became the first among the suspects. A previous conviction for a similar double crime, a recent return from prison, and living next to the victims. And the pattern of the old and new crimes was definitely similar. The officers went to Mikhalin's home, and at that moment he was just packing his things. "I want to go to Russia to earn some money," he said, when they asked him where he was planning to go. The officers agreed to let Mikhalin go, but insisted he come with them first. He realized he had been caught. Already on the day of his arrest, Alexei wrote a full confession in which he called himself the one who took the lives of the Fatayev brother and sister. However, according to his account, things unfolded very differently. Yes, he is guilty of the deaths of Victor and Raisa Fatayev, but the man attacked him. Mikhail himself did not expect it. He barely had time to knock on the door and ask about the scissors when Victor rushed out and lunged at him with his fists. Raisa joined in later with a stick. The brother and sister were beating poor Michalenia until he finally broke free and ran to the gate. Victor rushed after him, determined to tell everything to Father Alexei and call the police. Alexei couldn't allow this. He had just been released, he was drunk, and the police would surely take him away in no time. He attacked Victor at the gate to defend himself, Michalenia insisted, and he certainly had no intention of taking his life. As for Raisa, she was swinging a stick like a madwoman. He had to try really hard to calm her down. Only the nails driven into her eyes helped. Michalenia talked about the nails as if he even enjoyed it. The investigators saw that the criminal seemed to transform as he recreated the events of that fateful night, savoring the details and repeating the bloody particulars. During the search of Michalenia's house, blood-stained clothes and towels were also found. This became additional evidence of his guilt. In 2017, the trial took place. Alexei Michalenia was charged under
a serious article,
causing the death of 2 or more people committed with particular cruelty by a person who had previously committed a serious crime. The forensic psychiatric examination confirmed that, despite mild intellectual disability, Michalenia was sane at the time of the crime and understood the nature of his actions. Alcohol intoxication was also an aggravating factor. At the court hearing, Michalenia appeared indifferent and detached. By the verdict, he was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment, death penalty. In addition, he was required to pay compensation for moral damages to the victims. As of today, the death penalty has been abolished or is under a moratorium in almost all Commonwealth of Independent States and European countries. Among European countries, the only country where this type of punishment is still applied is Belarus. Death is a terrible punishment for a criminal, whether it's a hardened repeat offender or someone who ended up behind bars for the first time. However, Alexei Michalin was not at all surprised or frightened by the possibility of being executed with a bullet to the back of his head after such a sentence. He calmly accepted the sentence and requested not to have the death penalty commuted to life imprisonment. According to him, he deserved the execution. "I myself can't explain why I acted that way," he said in the final part of his last statement. The death sentence for Michalenia was the first to be handed down in Belarus in 2017. Later, the death penalty was also handed down to 2 other infamously known black realtors from Mogilev, Igor Gershankov and Semyon Berezhnov. By the way, there is a video about these realtors on the channel, so be sure to check it out. Soon after the trial, Michalenia realized that he was not ready to die. He was only 33, and even though he had spent half his life in prison, he didn't want to lose it completely. He filed an appeal, and in June 2017 his complaint was reviewed by the Supreme Court of the country. This time, Michalenia no longer tried to appear indifferent. He said that he deeply regretted the crime he had committed and asked the victims for forgiveness. "I am ready to give my life to bring your loved ones back," he said, after which he began to recount the circumstances of the crime again, in such detail that the judge had to interrupt him. "Your Honor, I feel disgusted, ashamed and afraid. Please let me live, even if it's behind bars," the criminal said. In his appeal, Michalenia drew attention to circumstances that were overlooked or not taken into account by the court of first instance. For example, he pointed out that he blew into the breathalyzer tube twice and that the first result was neutral. But only the second result, which showed a high level of exhaled alcohol, was included in the case file. The forensic exam revealed bruises and abrasions on Michaleni's body, indicating a fight with Fateyev. However, the court failed to consider this and did not summon the experts to the courtroom. The Supreme Court did not overturn the sentence, and at the beginning of 2018, Michaleni still faced the death penalty. Most likely someone had already told him how this would happen. Most likely Michaleni had played out this scenario in his head many times. One day the firing squad will come for him. They will blindfold him and lead him into a special room where he will be ordered to kneel. When he, frozen with fear, obeys this order, they will press the barrel of a pistol to the back of his head, and then there will be a shot and oblivion. Dying was frightening. Alexei begged his father to save him. And in February 2018, Arkady Michalenia sent an appeal to the United Nations Human Rights Committee. In response, the committee asked the authorities of Belarus to postpone the execution of the sentence until the complaint is reviewed. However, already on the night of May 15th to 16th, they still came for Alexei Michalenia. He was taken out of the pre-trial detention cell and he never returned. The sentence was carried out. The United Nations Human Rights Committee published its decision on the appeal, Michalenia only in 2021. In this decision, it was stated that Alexei Michalenia was sentenced to death as a result of an unfair trial. But it was 3 years late. Early in the morning on August 29, 2013, Vladimir Mikhailovich, a guard at the House of Creativity located in the Belarusian city of Rechica, began performing his daily duties. The sun, barely rising above the horizon, lit up the sleepy trees. Its rays slid across the roof of the building, the bushes and the dew-covered grass. In some places it thinned out, exposing the brown earth. Not far from the place being tidied up by the watchman, a large bright spot could be seen. Putting the broom aside, Vladimir Mikhailovich headed straight for it, and as he got closer, the spot more and more took on the shape of a human body. When the man came right up close, he almost lost consciousness. In front of him lay the body of a young girl. It was not hard to guess this from the delicate hands, slender fingers, and the long hair matted into a single bloody mass. The unfortunate girl's face was practically destroyed. It was barely possible to make out the eyes, nose, and lips on her face. The naked body lay on its back with patches of clean skin alternating with open wounds. Her clothes were scattered next to the girl. Nearby lay an open purse. In the short blades of grass, something else could be seen. Vladimir Mikhailovich looked more closely and covered his face with his hands. They were the girl's internal organs. The police officers quickly arrived at the scene of the incident. Even they, hardened by dozens of different sights, felt horror as they looked at the mutilated young body. The forensic medical examiner made a shocking conclusion. The victim's internal organs had been torn out through the perineum. The person who did this must have possessed extraordinary strength and the habits of a predatory beast. The investigators questioned local residents, trying to find out if they had heard any suspicious sounds during the night. Yes, there were sounds, piercing screams of a girl. However, none of the witnesses considered what they heard to be of much importance. The body was discovered in an area popular among young people, who would go there to drink, argue, and enjoy themselves. The residents attributed the screams to yet another display of emotions during a conflict between young people. In part, this turned out to be true. There really was a conflict, but it didn't happen among a group of tipsy teenagers. It was between a girl and a guy who barely knew each other. In mere hours, investigators pieced together the entire tragic event. On August 28, 2013, 19-year-old Olesia Atamanchuk went to the bistro banquet hall. Her colleague was celebrating an anniversary. It was hard to imagine a more pleasant way to end the day. Although for Olesia, unlike her peers, it was much more pleasant to spend the evening with her family, have fun with her brothers, and share her future plans with her mother. Olesia was a home-loving girl, well-mannered and modest. She loved to cook, so she got a job as a pastry chef at the local Café Polesi. When, on one of the last days of summer, a wave of gentle twilight covered the city, the girl was walking down the street, inspired by the prospect of the upcoming weekend. Tomorrow she will go to her parents, but before that, a festive dinner and long conversations with her colleagues from the shop await her. In the midst of the feast, Olesia's phone rang. At first, the girl thought it was her mother or someone from her family, but the name Gina appeared on the display. She met Gina Kuzmin quite recently. Not even 2 weeks have passed since their first meeting. All the romance in their relationship consisted of occasional walks and messaging on social networks. Gina was not a persistent suitor, but that evening he suddenly showed an unusual determination for him. He expressed a desire to meet the girl right outside the restaurant where she was. Olesia was surprised, but she agreed to it. Gina didn't keep her waiting long and showed up at the appointed place accompanied by 2 young people, completely unfamiliar to the girl. It smelled of alcohol. The guys had already managed to have a shot of liquor. The friends weren't planning to leave, and diligent Olesia didn't promise to brighten their time with her company. She couldn't bring herself to leave the birthday girl. As the girl returned to bistro and re-engaged with the gathering's atmosphere, the guys were also staying active. They went to the nearest store, drank in a courtyard, and then, just in case, returned for Olesia, which proved to be the right decision. The celebration guests were departing for home. Soon Gina's acquaintance also appeared on the porch. The group of 4 was waiting for a walk through Rechica, which was sparkling with night lights. Halfway there, Gina and Olesia suddenly quarreled with each other. Yes, so strongly that the young man, without saying another word, walked away, leaving the girl in the company of his friends Vadim Belov and Sergei Ivanov. As it turned out, they had also met only recently. Inside, the girl lamented Gennady's recklessness for leaving her with 2 strangers in the city center when it was already long past midnight. Many anxious thoughts raced through her mind. The third one, as is known, is unnecessary. Vadim quickly decided to leave his new friends, leaving Olesia alone with Sergei. They strolled through the streets, immersed in the yellow streetlight's glow. At some point, the girl felt the heavy hand of her companion smoothly sliding along her waist. She didn't like it at all, and she tried to calm Sergei's ardor. Ahead, the windows of the local crafts center gleamed. Olesia once again felt the unpleasant touch, and with a single movement of her hand, she didn't let him repeat it. But what was this girl's hand compared to the massive palm of the guy walking beside her? Sergei got angry and roughly grabbed Olesia by the shoulders, then tried to take her clothes off. The girl was outraged. She pushed him away from herself, fiercely and stubbornly fought back, wanting to defend herself, and shouted loudly. However, in the next moment, Olesia received a strong punch to the face, which knocked her off her feet. Lying sprawled on the grass, she felt the inhuman gaze of her attacker on her. Sergei was hitting her in the face and neck. As he later admitted himself, there were about 15 such blows. According to the results of the forensic medical examination, the victim had facial bone fractures, knocked out teeth, extensive bruising on the head, injuries to internal genital organs, and a ruptured bladder. Still in a frenzy, Sergei tore part of the girl's small intestine from her perineum. Olesia died from shock due to pain, never receiving help. When Sergei came to his senses and sobered up a bit, he saw a naked and bloodied girl lying in front of him, obviously dead. He fled the crime scene and disappeared from the radar for several days until he was finally caught by the police. During the interrogation of his friend Gina Kuzmin, Gina's phone rang. Sergei was on the line. The investigators forced him to arrange another meeting with his friend at one of the city's school stadiums. That's where Sergei Ivanov was arrested. It turned out that the detainee had quite an impressive criminal record. Literally right before the attack on Olesia Atamanchuk, he almost took another person's life. In a bar called Neptune, a fight broke out between Sergei and another guy. One powerful blow from Ivanov sent his opponent to the intensive care unit, where he spent several months and miraculously survived. The youngest of the three sons in the Ivanov family, Sergei, had the most difficult character. When sober, he was quite a pleasant person to talk to, but as soon as he took literally just a few sips, he would completely lose control of himself. Sergei could easily knock out anyone who said an unflattering remark about him or any of his friends. After Sergei's father took his own life, he, being just a little boy, withdrew into himself. Over time, this tragedy turned him into a troubled teenager. Sergei had problems at school, and his mother often had to feel embarrassed because of him. When he turned 14, he found close friends. In other words, he got involved with the wrong crowd. They spent their time robbing lonely women and old people on the banks of the Dnipro River. For these crimes, Sergei and his friends received their first
sentence. Later,
Ivanov was imprisoned twice more, but to no avail. He did not reconsider his life path. In February 2013, he returned home after spending several years in a penal colony. The same cynical, bold and cold-blooded Sergei didn't even think about getting a job. All he was interested in was easy money and drinking. Nighttime outings to city parks became a kind of hobby for him. There, the guy attacked passers-by, beat them, including with metal rods, and took their valuables and money. And afterwards he would visit bars and pubs where he would celebrate his achievements with gusto. The victims did not report to the police. On August 4th, 2013, Sergei and his friends attacked men at a bus stop. The attackers beat the strangers for an incredibly foolish reason. They didn't like how they looked. After the sadists let their fists do the talking, they followed their usual scenario and robbed the men, even taking their bags of groceries. During the interrogation after what was probably his most terrible crime, Ivanov couldn't clearly explain why he took the life of a young woman. He repeatedly insisted that he hadn't intended to commit an assault, claiming he simply lost his mind. However, for investigators, the motive was clear. Olesya had denied him intimacy. And this fueled a dangerous cocktail of all negative emotions: resentment, anger, and hatred. In 2015, Sergei Ivanov was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment, death penalty. The criminal sought forgiveness from Olesya Atamanchuk's relatives, especially her mother. He also apologized to his own mother, who, upon learning what her son had done, disowned him forever. Ivanov considered the verdict to be fair, referring to the fact that the life he had taken was compensated by the life taken from him. However, despite his statements, he persistently filed appeals to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, just like his brother Alexei. None of these complaints was considered, and on April 18, 2016, 22-year-old Sergei Ivanov was executed by shooting. Olesya Atamanchuk's mother, Olga Stanislavovna, still cannot come to terms with the fact that her daughter will never call her on the phone again or fool around with her brothers, just like many years ago. Olesya loved life very much, loved her job, and especially adored children. On the eve of her death, she wrote on social media, "I want a daughter and a son." Mikhail Moskalyov was born in Belarus, in Grodno, in 1970. When he was tried in Obninsk for one crime, it turned out that it was the last in a series previously committed by Rokovaya. It became so for Moskalyov. Midnight, October 7th, 1990, when a police patrol detained him in an underground passage. With a kitchen knife, which an hour earlier had been used to stab the chest of Obninsk resident Shirokovsky, Moskalyov had randomly met firefighter Shirokovsky in the station buffet of the city of Kaluga, introducing himself as a tourist, while in reality he was hiding. After arriving from Grodno following the murder of 10th grader Ira Kulakova, Shirokovsky invited the sociable tourists to his home. A group gathered in Obninsk and had some drinks. When all the guests left, his acquaintance Tanya E. came to see the host, and they went into one of the rooms alone together. After a while, Moskalyov attempted to enter the residence. When the host opened the door, Moskalyov shoved him into the bathroom and started strangling him from behind, then stabbed him in the chest with a kitchen knife. Shirokovsky was bleeding and Tanya rushed to help him. As both later testified during the interrogation, a transformation occurred in Moskalyov. He became enraged, grabbed two kitchen knives and shouted for them not to move. that he was a monstrous killer with 2 bodies on him in Grodno and nothing to lose, they froze in terror. Moskalev grabbed the girl and, holding a knife to her throat, tore off her gold earrings and demanded that she undress. Then, threatening her with murder, he assaulted the girl. At the same time, he committed a series of acts that senior justice advisor Osipov later described as bizarre, and which Moskalev repeated during attacks on other victims. Here, at Shirokovsky's apartment, Moskalev cut the waistband of Tanya's underwear, putting into this act a certain symbol of his dominance over the defeated victim. When Moskalev left the room, he discovered that the wounded Shirokovsky had disappeared. Then he dragged Tanya outside in just a shirt, saying that the police would be coming here soon. Threatening her with murder, he assaulted her again, taking her into the drawing room of one of the apartment buildings in the neighborhood. On the way to the Obninskaya station, Moskalyov was detained in the underground passage based on the description that Shirokovsky managed to provide. A little later, Osipov and other members of the investigative team went to Grodno to study the personality of the suspect and his past record of offenses. They interviewed hundreds, including Moskalyov's classmates from school and vocational school. A huge amount of material was collected, including the birth certificate, which contained important information for the investigation. Misha's mother gave birth to him at 17 without a husband. A medical examination showed that Moskalev had a tattoo of a skull and a winged cherub on his arm. He generally liked to decorate his clothes with intimidating symbols, skeletons, skulls, snarling animal faces. He wore a bracelet made of razor blades. Being a tough guy doesn't mean much alone. Many teenagers are captivated by such symbolism. Their excesses don't go beyond noisy gatherings at idol concerts and fights. As they get older, this childish fascination with scary things fades away. Moskalyov, on the other hand, was taking these otherworldly, beastly and superhuman fetishes, fantasies and allegories more and more seriously. He saw himself as someone with special rights, unlike everyone else. He joined a bodybuilding club, developed his muscles, nurtured a personal cult of strength, reveled in his sense of superiority, and took pride in his ruthlessness. There's an episode in the case when he snatched a kitten from an old woman's hands near the entrance and, smiling, smashed its head against the wall right in front of her. And when the old woman screamed, he hit her. When the investigators arrived in Grodno and started digging into his past, they discovered 2 unsolved murders that were very similar in their modus operandi. In the first case, in a room at the Neiman Shoe Factory dormitory, they found Tatiana Lisey, 25 years old, dead. Her 2-year-old son was crying over his mother's body. This happened in August of 1990. The day before Moskalev was here in front of witnesses, he brought alcohol. Tanya was found in the bathroom with a cord from an electric iron around her neck. Her face and body were covered in bruises from being punched. The bodily injuries were of a torturous nature, with particular cruelty, and were inflicted in the presence of a child. From the report, the victim was found to have signs of strangulation carried out in a particular manner. Moskalyov, as it would later be revealed, repeatedly used this method to bring his victims into a state of asphyxia, in which a half-conscious, helpless victim could be subjected to anything the perpetrator intended. It's unknown how long it would have taken to discover the tragedy if the boy hadn't cried and pulled at the door handle for almost a whole day after what happened. The examination revealed that the victim's suicide had been staged. Death was not caused by the cord, but by mechanical asphyxia as a result of manual strangulation. Moskalev immediately came under the investigator's scrutiny, but he somehow managed to mislead the investigation. Moskalev pinned it on another person, managed to dodge all the investigator's traps, and at the end of August 1990 he was released from custody. Since the sexual act and the bruises couldn't be denied, Moskalev explained it by saying that the victim was a masochist and had asked him to beat her for greater pleasure. A week and a half after Moskalev was released in that same Grodno, on September 5th, 1990, around midnight, an unknown person attacked Sosnovskaya in a vacant lot. A 28 years old, a kindergarten teacher at post office Kimvolokno, with the intent to rape and murder her. He grabbed the victim from behind by the neck, squeezing her throat so that she lost consciousness. The victim resisted as best she could whenever she regained consciousness, and the maniac beat her with his fists, inflicting severe bodily injuries to her face and body that caused extreme suffering. Natalia Sosnovskaya was saved by a married couple who happened to be walking along the path. The maniac was forced to flee. The woman went to the police and reported the description of her attacker. She especially remembered his lightened, bleached hair, his hairstyle, his hawk-like nose, the way he looked from under his brows, and his speech with an accent, either Ukrainian or Belarusian. She said she would recognize this man out of 1,000, the one who told her, "If you go to the police, yes, they'll find you dead here in the morning." But the investigation yielded nothing. 3 weeks later, on October 1st, 1990, the body of Ira Kulakova, a 15-year-old 10th grade student, was found showing signs of violent death. The body was discovered on the elevator shaft roof in Moskalev's mother's apartment building where she resided. And that same morning, Moskalev disappears from Grodno, boards the Warsaw-Moscow train, so that 5 days later, on October 6, 1990, he appears in Obninsk and carries out a bloody massacre in Shirokovsky's apartment. When Shevchenko, Osipov and their assistants started working with Moskalev, the investigation gained momentum. Faster, more productive. Natalia Sosnovskaya identified Moskalev, who had attacked her in the wasteland. Then all of Moskalev's previous denials in the case of the deaths of Tanya Lisaya and Ira Kulakova fell apart. Following the investigation's numerous expert examinations, it meticulously organized the collection of materials and established a system of investigative experiments. After the results of the expert examinations in the Lisaya case, Moskalev himself requested to see the investigator and confess to the murder. The investigator established that there was a similarity in the method of killing Lisaya Kulakova, as well as in the attempts to strangle Shirokovsky and Tanya L. And the most subtle thing is that in almost all cases, the criminal committed bizarre acts while mocking the victim, a manner that was noticed and led to a common denominator. Both with Lisaya and in other cases. As already mentioned, the criminal cut the underwear with a knife, removing other details of the clothing. And he also liked to lie in the bath with pine extract for hours after that. This was Moskalev's signature, undeniably evident in the murder and rape of Ira Kulakova. There was a girl named Ira, a schoolgirl, who was friends with boys and girls and dreamed of becoming a primary school teacher. The 8th volume contains testimony about the deceased. She never expected evil from people. She believed that all people are kind. She was slender, 45 kilos. And so one day the girl went with her friends and some boys they knew to the Niemen River embankment, to the old pier, just because they had nothing else to do. A certain young man also showed up, introducing himself as a lieutenant of the customs office at the Grodno railway station. He was handsome, well-built, muscular, but he looked at her from under his brows as if half turned away. Near midnight, the lieutenant hailed a taxi by the Textile Workers' Palace of Culture. He promised Iru he would take her home and had her join him in the car in front of everyone. 2 friends, seeing this, ran to the car but didn't make it. 5 meters away from them, the taxi started moving, taking Iru on her final journey. And then it was terrible. Moskalyov took Iru to the roof of his 12-story building and attacked her. The scene of the incident still bears traces of desperate resistance. The maniac relieved his soul with monstrous cruelty, and in the end resorted to strangulation and a stab to the chest, after which he felt elation. Later, when in his mother's apartment in the basement of that very same building, they will find a knife with Irina's traces and blood, as well as her blood-stained jeans, jacket and sweater. Moskalev stated during the interrogation on November 1st, "Regarding the murder of Kulakova, I can say that I was psychologically set on this murder. I needed a release. Kulakova happened to be there and I killed her." From the forensic medical examination report, the separation of the toe parts of both stockings occurred partially due to the action of a sharp object. Fresh tears of the hymen and traces of male semen were found. The Moskalev case, following the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse, also split into separate sovereign territories. All the episodes connected with Grodno went to Belarus, and only the Russian episode involving the stabbing near Shirokovsky remained for the Obninsk Brigade. And suddenly, when it seemed like everything was over, a red small atlas of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics belonging to Moskalev was found behind the kitchen cabinet in Shirokovsky's apartment. Its belonging to Moskalev was indisputably confirmed by notes in the margins and many other things. But the most sensational thing was that routes had been drawn by Moskalev's hand on the maps, and next to the names of the settlements Grodno, Ivi, Baranovichi, Ashmiani, there were large and small crosses. There was such a cross in Kaluga as well. Between Kaluga and Obninsk there was a large dot depicted in the form of a grave. What is this? Is this a scheme of murders they committed or only planned, or is it wild nonsense, the fevered fantasy of some dark inspiration? During the interrogations, they only established that in some of the marked cities, Moskalev was on business trips. For the crimes he committed, Moskalev was sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. However, in 1999, the death penalty was abolished and replaced with a life sentence. Move, move, Zayatek, the older one urged the younger, skillfully maneuvering in the dark. Bottles of vodka were carefully placed into the pre-prepared bags, along with packs of cigarettes, paperosi and chocolate bars. Then the older one skillfully pried open the cash register drawer. A thick wad of money immediately found its way into the pocket of his worn jacket. Another moment, and the accomplices, bent under the weight of the bags, slowly shuffled down the deserted night street. Hey, you hear me? You're hauling chocolate. Stash it somewhere safer and come to me. Let's celebrate this job, said the elder to the younger as they parted. He nodded affirmatively and opening the gate to his house quietly slipped into the shed. Soon, the bags with the stolen goods were securely hidden under a pile of all sorts of junk. They drank, snacked on chocolate and smoked good cigarettes. The wife of the elder Vishla joined the group after downing a couple of shots, glanced at the improvised table, and the daughter, when offered a drink, wrinkled her nose in disgust and soon took the younger one into the room. The door slammed, then the bed creaked. The son-in-law lay down with Oksana again. They'll get along, the elder said with a drunken laugh, pouring another generous dose of alcohol. That's how prosaically and routinely that nightmare began, which for several months kept the residents of the village of Kolmich in the Rechitsa district of the Gomel region in constant tension. It all started with the banal robbery of the local store. When the salespeople came to work in the morning, they saw that someone had thoroughly rummaged through the store. The alarm didn't go off, and when was the last time anyone repaired it in the long-forgotten Selmeg? The police task force couldn't pick up the trail either. The residents of the nearby houses couldn't say anything substantial. Alas, if only one of the villagers had led the police to the trail. If one of the robbers, Sergei Starovoitov, also known as Zitek, had been arrested immediately, then what happened literally 2 days after the robbery would never have occurred. It was then that Anna K., the saleswoman from that very store, turned to the city police department with a request to find her missing 14-year-old daughter, Tatiana. The search at first yielded nothing, although a chain and the girl's scarf were found behind one of the sheds, but there was no trace of her herself. Only on the third day did the terrible news spread throughout the village. From an abandoned well on the edge of Kolmichi, the mutilated and naked body of the girl was recovered, with a bag of cement tied to it. Deprivation of life is not a trivial robbery. The machinery of investigation started working at full speed. The investigators questioned Tatiana's peers and friends one after another, searching for those who saw her last alive and well. The truth was partially revealed by the late Sergei Zhukov, a classmate. I attended my friend Mikhail Belyakov's birthday party with Tanya. While drinking and snacking, I began feeling unwell and stepped out onto the porch. Tanya exited the house heavily intoxicated and requested I escort her home. We began walking together but stumbled and fell multiple times. Then Oleg Mironenko came up to us, took Tatiana away, and I fell asleep right there on the porch. When I woke up, there was no one around. So the first surname was called, and soon that very Oleg Mironenko, Sergei Starovoitov. Sergei Kolesnik and Alexander Prokopenko were taken to the city police department as suspects in the abuse and murder of the underage Tatiana E. Later, another charge of robbery was added to these terrible accusations against Alexander Prokopenko. Against the backdrop of this terrible event that shocked the village, another theft went almost unnoticed. From that very Selmag, no one saw how clumsily. Moving on crutches, the man made his way to the back door of the store, skillfully dealt with the lock and entered the sales area, soon leaving from there. With the standard set of stolen goods, vodka, cigarettes, chocolate, money. No one saw anything. And a few days later, when the ill-fated store was robbed again, the mysterious thief left no traces when the store was robbed for the 4th time. The lucky thief was revealed as Nikolai Kotov, a 32-year-old mechanic at the local collective farm. He recently became a local after serving an 8-year sentence for taking a life, settling in with Valentina Savinyuk. They turned out to be quite the family. Both husband and wife often drank together, and then with loud shouting sorted out their relationship. The underage stepdaughter, Oksana Kotova, did not take part in the drinking sessions, but she openly lived together with another underage person, Sergei Starovoitov, with whom Kotov committed his first theft from a store. Her motive sounded quite noble. They needed to get alcohol. For the upcoming wedding, Zaitek, without any hesitation, agreed. And then came that fateful evening, which proved to be Tatiana E.'s last. On his birthday, all the village's golden youth gathered at Mikhail Belyakov's place. 17-year-old tractor driver Oleg Mironenko from the local collective farm, 16-year-old vocational student Alexander Prokopenko, 20-year-old unemployed Sergei Kolesnik, 14-year-old schoolboy Sergei Zhukov, and his peer Tatiana E. Sergei Starovoitov was also present together with his underage but already pregnant wife Oksana. There were no adults present, so the young collective farm workers drank freely, as they were used to from an early age, and snacked just a little less. They got drunk, quickly overdid it with alcohol, and Tatiana went outside. Her unlucky escort Sergei Zhukov was no less drunk. What came out of their walk home together we already know, but here is how Sergei Starovoitov describes the subsequent events. When we were leaving the birthday party, Oleg Mironenko, who was standing next to the drunk Tanya E., called me over. I hugged her and led her to the gazebo, where I wanted to have sexual intercourse with her, but I couldn't. I called Mironenko and we took her to the shed, where Mironenko stayed with her, and I took Oksana home. I came back and saw that Mironenko was raping Tatiana, and nearby stood Kolesnik and Prokopenko. The scoundrels abused the helpless, unresisting girl one after another. That's the truth, for the record. Each of them stubbornly denied their involvement in this. They said, "I couldn't do it." However, it has been irrefutably proven that every single one of them participated in this vile act. Let us note that at this time Tatiana's parents were already searching for her, and they even passed by the ill-fated sheds, heard some commotion behind them, and heard from a local teacher who was out for a walk. Someone from the young people is making love. The parents' hearts did not tell them that it was their daughter who was in trouble. And at some point the girl regained consciousness and saw her attackers. She recognized Kolesnik and Starovoitov and called out their names. The guys got scared of the impending punishment, and judging by the unanimous confessions of the others, it was Sergei Starovoitov who suggested they smash her head. Kolesnik mockingly supported him, suggesting they knock out her memory so she wouldn't snitch. Hearing this, the girl, sprawled on the ground, begged them to let her go, promising not to tell anyone anything. Alas, the attackers had already made their decision. They beat and kicked Tatiana, jumped on her chest, breaking her ribs, and strangled her with an elastic bandage that appeared out of nowhere. The dying gasps of the unfortunate girl only excited the monsters even more. And Kolesnik, who was the oldest of them all, watched jealously to make sure that each of those present delivered their own blow. The climax of the execution came when Starovoitov lifted a heavy 36-kilogram stone and brought it down on the girl's already crushed head. The unfortunate body convulsed a few more times, and then a dead silence fell, broken only by the heavy breathing of the attackers, who had instantly turned into murderers. No one felt any remorse after what they had done. The clothes were neatly folded and handed over to Prokopenko for subsequent sale, while the deceased, cold-bloodedly lifted, was carried out of the village and thrown into a stream. However, this hiding place seemed unreliable to Kolesnik. The body was clearly visible in the shallow water, the cooling corpse was pulled out of the water, a sack of cement was dragged over, and a deep abandoned well on the edge of the village became the victim's final resting place. Later, when the body was discovered, experts counted that no less than 120 blows had been inflicted on the unfortunate person. After brutally taking the life of a girl they knew, the criminals parted ways as if nothing had happened. Sergei Starovoitov went to his waiting wife, while the others went to their homes. In the following days, they lamented her disappearance and helped with the search. Only later, once behind bars, did they start blaming each other and trying to shift the guilt. That helped little. The investigation meticulously reconstructed the crime scene. In court, each person's guilt was proven beyond a doubt. All the mentioned accomplices in the murder, including their spiritual leader, Starovoitov's father-in-law, and the repeat offender Kotov, have been imprisoned for many years. The case of the black realtors shocked the public. In Mogilev, 6 people were killed and 3 more murders were being prepared. The criminals drugged their victims, wrapped their faces and hands with tape, and threw them into graves. Some of them were still alive at the time. The prosecutor compared the defendants to fascists and called their actions a death conveyor. But the defendants themselves kept shifting the blame onto each other until the very end. The sentence: 2 death penalties and 2 terms of over 20 years. However, it's still too early to put a final point in this case. Who could have committed such terrible crimes? The calmest person at the trial was the key figure in the case, Igor Gershankov, 36 years old, with a secondary specialized education, 2 children, and officially unemployed. He prepared for each session, carefully wrote something in his notebook, and answered the prosecutor's questions very cautiously. He appeared to be a smart and intelligent man, but according to the investigation, he was the organizer of all the crimes. Igor first had problems with the law in 2006 when he was convicted for illegal business activities. In 2009 he was sentenced for theft, and in 2010 he received a 5-year sentence for fraud related to apartment sales. But already in 2012 Gershankov was released on parole and almost immediately went back to his old ways. But now he wasn't just scamming people for money. With the help of accomplices, he killed his victims and helped him. According to the indictment, his wife Tatyana Gershankova, the woman's cynicism is astonishing. She persuaded the victims to sell their apartments while she was pregnant. Igor met her in 2002. She had just finished school. She was only 17 years old, said Lyudmila Gershankova, Igor's mother, in an interview. He is 5 years her senior. They began cohabiting in a civil union. Tatyana's mother was very pleased that her daughter managed to get together with a young man from a prosperous and well-off family. The materials indicate that from 2002 to 2008 the spouses were engaged in fraud. They persuaded lonely people who abused alcohol to exchange their apartments for a cheaper option, but in the end they never returned the difference. Their first child was born during this time. One day my son comes home and boasts, "Mom, we're going to deal with apartments. There are people who don't pay for their apartments and they have big debts." I nearly passed out. Do you know that smell, Reshetkoi? But my words didn't matter at all, Igor's mother said. Drunks were given the worst housing for apartments. It was for this that in 2010 the Gershankovs were convicted. Igor was given 5 years in a penal colony and his wife got 4. Later, it was revealed that Igor was involved in 2 murders. That is, when the Gershankov spouses were sentenced for fraud in 2010, there were already lost souls behind them.
But they were convicted for this much later?
At the end of 2011, Tatyana was released on parole, and the following year her husband was also conditionally released early. Then once again real estate scams started up. According to Lyudmila Gershankova, Igor and Tatyana initially bought a 1-room apartment in central Mogilev. Later, they sold it and purchased a 3-room apartment in the same building. By that time, Tatyana was already pregnant with their second child. They privatized 5 apartments and paid off their debts, Igor's mother noted. The woman said she had no idea that her son was killing the owners of the apartments. She blames Tatyana for everything, believing that she was the mastermind, telling Igor where to go and what to do. My son is a fool. To lead people, you need to have a good memory, but he only wrote everything down in his notebooks. He always asked Tanya about everything. In their family, to be honest, Igor is like the woman and Tanya is like the man, explained Lyudmila Gershankova. However, Tatyana maintains a different story. She claims she was unaware that her husband and his accomplices were committing murders. She acknowledges the fraud, but nothing further. I am the first woman in Belarus who is facing a 24-year sentence without having killed a single person, Lyudmila Gershankova said with tears in her eyes in her final statement. She really was not present at the murders, but according to the investigation, she was the direct organizer of the crimes. The most nervous person at the trial appeared to be 31-year-old Boris Kolesnikov. He covered his face and threatened that if journalists wrote even a word about him, he would commit suicide right in his cell. Kolesnikov had 5 prior convictions for theft, fraud, hooliganism and robbery. He is connected with Igor Gershankov by a robbery in 2008 and 2 murders in 2009 and 2013. According to the indictment, 31-year-old Semen Berezhnoy joined the criminal activity. It was he who gave a confession, showed most of the burial sites and provided the addresses of the apartments, in the hope that he would receive a more lenient sentence for his confession. The court sentenced him to execution by shooting. Just like Gershankova, Tatyana was given 24 years in a penal colony and Boris Kolesnikov received 22 years. During the trial, the defendants kept shifting the blame onto each other. According to the charges, Gershankov committed his first murder in 2009, but this would not become known right away. The investigation managed to find out that in 2015, a lonely military pensioner named Viktor Yefremenko had a 2-room apartment and a debt of $2,000 in utility payments. Tatiana Gershankova persuaded the man to exchange his apartment for a 1-room apartment with an extra payment, of course. They even showed him the new apartment in the city center, but the client hesitated to make the deal, suspecting something was wrong. This did not suit the Gershankovs at all. Yefremenko was taken to a rented apartment, kept there for 2 weeks and then killed. The man was lucky that, by a fortunate coincidence, a former classmate became interested in his apartment. When Yefremenko, as the owner, was brought to show the apartment to a potential buyer, the classmate also began to doubt the legitimacy of the deal. Yefremenko jumped into her car near the bank. They deposited the apartment money into the owner's account. From the next day, the man, fearing for his safety, began to hide from the criminals. Despite the failed deal with Yefremenko, they already had their next victim lined up. A lonely pensioner, Yuri Rodnov, the owner of a 3-room apartment in Mogilev, and his own brother. The scheme remained consistent, settling utility debts, downsizing to a cheaper apartment, pledging to refund the difference, and even offering job search assistance. On March 26, 2015, the pensioner was taken to finalize the deal. After such drinking sessions, the young man never returned home. They added clonidine to the alcohol, then strangled him and threw him into a grave. A spot at the cemetery had already been prepared for him. What saved him was that the realtors were being watched, so the group was detained as they were leaving the city. From that moment, the investigators began to unravel the web of crimes. The case has around 40 episodes, but we'll focus on the most prominent ones. In 2008, Kolesnikov and Gershankov committed an armed robbery at the technology store in Mogilev. They prepared thoroughly. They had a hat with eye holes and a fake pistol. The perpetrator was Boris Kolesnikov. Upon entering the store, he demanded the salesperson lie down and stole multiple computers. Gershankov waited in the getaway car. The friends sold the stolen goods in Minsk in 2009 and Gershankov goes on to commit murder. A few months before this, he finds the owner of a 1-room apartment, Melnichenko, who lives with his partner. Both the man and the woman abuse alcohol. The realtor promises them a profitable deal, but instead takes the apartment owner out, asks him to get out of the car to help with some repairs, and then pulls out a bat and strikes him several times. Then they suffocate the victim and wrap him in tape so that even if he regains consciousness, he still won't survive, and they take the person to the cemetery. The method of eliminating the victims was about the same each time: get them drunk, finish them off, and bury them. This happened after the suggestion to celebrate a successful deal. The day after Melnichenko's murder, the criminals dealt with his partner, who thought she was moving into a new home. Gershankov, with the help of Kolesnikov, sewed her up, wrapped her with tape, and buried her in the cemetery. The scene that the experts and investigators saw after the exhumation of the bodies was not for the faint of heart. Even experienced officers say that they had never encountered such brutality before. And the group of black realtors continued their business from 2013 to 2015. They managed to kill 4 more people, and there were plans for 3 more victims. They had even prepared graves for them. According to the investigation, the roles among the members of the criminal group were clearly distributed. The organizers are named Igor and Tatiana Gershankov. They located victims, convinced them to sell their apartments, oversaw the transactions, and allocated the funds. Kolesnikov and Berezhnoi, according to the indictment, were more like executors, although Semyon Berezhnoi also went around to apartments, for example, posing as a bailiff who threatened eviction for unpaid utility bills. The criminals used fake names, wore glasses and wigs as disguises, and communicated using subscriber identity module cards registered to fake identities. For greater credibility, they would rent apartments for a day and present them as their own, offering them as exchange options. They conducted transactions through real estate agents and even gave money to the property owners to pay off utility debts in order not to arouse suspicion. Gershankov's first mistake was registering the apartments under their own and their relatives' names. Besides that, they didn't expect that the victims might go to the police. Some accomplices attempting to save themselves would disclose all locations and passwords. Tatiana often went to the deals with her husband. People saw them as a decent family couple, especially since Gershankova was pregnant for a certain period. In court, she cried and maintained that Berezhnoi's accusations against her were false. She firmly denied organizing the crimes. In the confrontation with Semen, her behavior was completely different. Black realtors in Mogilev operated for several years, working in a well-organized manner, destroying one victim after another and disposing of other people's property as if it were their own. A reasonable question arises: how did they manage to do this? First of all, Gershankov and his accomplices chose their victims among lonely people who had financial problems and were dependent on alcohol. When a person's debt for utilities exceeds several $1,000s, it means they haven't been paying for years. And when a person is dependent on the bottle, it's not that hard to make a deal with them using that very bottle. The calculation was simple: who would look for him at the cemetery? In addition, while carrying out their criminal activities, the spouses Gershankov and Berezhnoy developed a number of covert measures. They always introduced themselves to the victims using fake names, and in some cases they used wigs and glasses. When committing crimes, they always used phones registered to the victims or to front persons. At the same time, they constantly changed phone numbers. They communicated with each other either during personal meetings or by calling from payphones. They moved around in cars with partially covered or removed license plates and avoided visual contact with potential buyers or other people who could identify them. But some alarming signals still came through. In court, several witnesses immediately stated that they had contacted the police regarding the disappearance of Larionov, one of the victims. He was allegedly being tricked out of his apartment, but the police didn't react, and in court the district officer said no one had contacted him. Secondly, there was no proper control at rural cemeteries in the Mogilev region, and essentially no records were being kept. This gap was addressed after the case of the Black Realtors. The investigative committee initiated legislative changes regarding deaths. At a distance of 5 to 20 kilometers from the regional center, people were buried without any notification, without payment. That's why no one was surprised by the new graves. Only in the Chorsky district were locals vigilant. Knowing no one had died in the village, they reported the fresh cemetery grave to the district police officer. But the police officer didn't find anything suspicious about it. In addition, no preventive work was carried out with the Gershankov family. The husband and wife were convicted of large-scale fraud and received conditional early release. They quickly reverted to their old habits. Their expenses clearly did not match their income. Cars, apartments, but the regulatory authorities did not pay attention to this. Based on the practice of investigating such cases, it can be assumed that the criminal activities of black realtors are facilitated by law enforcement officers who cover for the criminals, as well as employees of settlement and cash centers and BRTI who provide the necessary information. However, the investigation did not establish the involvement of officials in this case, Berezhnoy. I claimed in court that Gershankova was protected by police, but this was not verified. Even Davers were involved in the search for physical evidence. The defendants appealed the verdict. The Supreme Court will review their case. Investigators still have questions for Igor Gershankov about his involvement in the disappearance of another person in July 2008. If the suspicions are confirmed, the execution of the death sentence will be postponed and Gershankov will be tried again.